Yes, thank you. I will be reading my paper because it's best for me and for you, especially because it's very philosophical and we, at this time it's very challenging. Okay, in my contribution to the April 2021 webinar, The Family and Integral Ecology, I presented a paper entitled Philosophers' Insights on the Family in the Light of Contemporary Challenges. I argued that the kind of giving and receiving that broadly characterizes family relationships is grounded on the characteristic transcendence of conjugal love, which by definition is a type of love open to and morally responsible for the generation of a human being. I further argue that expanding those kinds of trusting and cooperative relationships beyond family borders, thereby pointing at the ultimate meaning of justice in human relationships, is one of families' most significant contributions to the larger society, for which families can be viewed as proper sources of humanization. The discussion that followed revealed that some issues seem as deserving further conceptual clarification because of their relevance for understanding the underlying dynamics of family life. One of them was the very nature of love, which is what I will take up here. I think this exercise might also be relevant to mediate between what we could call romantic or sentimental views and institutional views of family life. I will first approach the issue from a linguistic perspective, and then will gradually move toward a more philosophical perspective in order to show how the manifold dimensions of love can be held together without diluting its ultimate meaning, namely that of a unifying force that works at all levels of being and is responsive to the goodness of being itself. Resorting to philology is a common strategy when it comes to clarifying the meaning of love. In his classical work on this topic, Joseph Pieper discusses the German language alleged shortcomings in this regard, and goes on to analyze the Latin and Greek words for love that have influenced modern European languages. Russian thinker Pavel Florensky also argued that in contrast to many other languages, which need periphrasis in order to clarify the manifold dimensions of human love, ancient Greek was privileged with 4 specific verbs, namely eramai, phileo, stergo, agapao. While stergo designates a quiet and firm sentiment of belonging that follows from the organic bonds between the lover and the loved object, eramai, from which the word eros comes, incorporates the idea of passionate love and desire. It goes beyond affection to also incorporate sensuality. Although eros is often used in the restricted sense of sexual desire, it represents the generic pathos of love that is also found in other forms of love. Aquinas carefully describes this as a pathos that leads to the unification of the lover and the beloved, causing their mutual indwelling as well as a sort of ecstasy in which lovers somehow exist outside of themselves. This pathos is source of zeal in the lover, a principle of everything that the lover does, bringing about changes whereby it best adapts to the beloved. Importantly, Aquinas holds that these pathos characteristic features are common to all forms of love, even if they do not originate in sensitive knowledge, but rather in intellectual knowledge or judgment. More interested in stressing the differences, Florensky recalls that the Greeks used agapao to mean the more rational love that follows from appraisal and judgment, which he then describes as neither passional nor ardent or tender, precisely because it is grounded on rational discernment, not inclination. Nevertheless, agapao is not pure knowledge. It also involves affection, which already inchoates the pathos of love. As we know, Christianity expanded the meaning of this verb, coining the word agape, thus incorporating the idea of self-giving and sacrificial love. 3 out of the 4 Latin words that Thomas Aquinas uses to account for the manifold dimensions of love partially echoed their Greek counterparts. Amor partially echoes eros, amicitia, philia, and dilectio, from diligere, echoes agapao. As we can see, stergo disappears from Aquinas' list, absorbed in the generic word amor, which he found broad enough to incorporate both the attachments rooted in natural inclination and the complacency following sensitive or intellectual knowledge. Finally, caritas represents a specific Christian contribution, the Latin translation of the New Testament agape, even though in Augustine's account, caritas includes some aspects of the other three. Aquinas explicitly observes that amor has a wider signification than the others, since every dilectio or caritas is love, but not vice versa. Indeed, dilectio implies, in addition to amor, a choice made beforehand. Therefore, dilectio is not in the concupiscible power, but only in the will, and only in the rational nature, not in chimpanzees. Amor broadly represents the Latin version of eros. Interestingly, Aquinas also noted that many people held amor to be more godlike than dilectio, arguing that it is possible for man to tend to God by love, being as it were passively drawn by him, more than he can possibly be drawn thereto by his reason, which pertains to the nature of dilectio. On the other hand, he also observes that, unlike amor and dilectio, which are expressed by way of passion or act, amicitia, friendship, is like a habit, and caritas can be taken either way, as a habit or as an act. Thus, when he refers to the friendly quality of a particular act of love, he prefers amor amicitiae, which he consistently contrasts with amor concupiscentiae. Finally, regarding caritas, all he says at this point is that it denotes, in addition to love, a certain perfection of love, insofar as that which is loved is held to be of great price, as the word itself implies, carus, which is. In the case of amicitia, friendship, we can clearly appreciate that human love cannot be fully grasped in terms of eramai or estergo, because it always entails a dimension of agape. It is not just a principle of desire, following natural inclination, but also a principle of gift and donation, which does not exist without dilectio, just as phileo entails both inclination and self-transcendence. Indeed, in the experience of friendship, we see how intimacy and transcendence are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, we will the good for our friends insofar as they are intimate to us. Importantly, there is more to love than just inclination or desire. If they were exactly the same thing, love would disappear once inclination or desire were satisfied. Yet, as a sort of complacency with the beloved, love is antecedent to desire and often persists when desire has been satisfied or had vanished. As an effusive force, ready to give itself to the other, as the fruit of abundance and plenitude, as agape. St. John's focus on this dimension of love enabled him to assert that God is love. Were he to have reduced love to eros in the Greek sense, he could not have written those words. For as a perfect being, God is not marked by any kind of desire or necessity. The Aristotelian God was an eternal being that acted as first mover, attracting all things. It was object, but not subject of love. It is very different from the God presented in the first verse of the Bible, a God who creates heaven and earth out of nothing. In the biblical tradition, creation is an absolute act of divine freedom, and never a necessary emanation from the divine essence. Through creation, God freely gives being to everything that exists. From this perspective, it is an absolute act of agape. We could say that unlike human love, God's love is absolutely creative, because it absolutely creates the good, along with the being that is object of this love. By contrast, human beings only love what they somehow antecedently perceive as good, it is, as appropriate to their own nature. But human nature is complex, as it is clear. Although we share an organic and sensitive nature with many other natural beings, ours is ultimately endowed with reason. This impacts the specific nature of human love, which is neither pure eros nor pure agape. We humans are imperfect beings in search of our own fulfillment, and thus naturally and intimately affected by a number of appetites and desires. Yet we are also rational and free beings, able to give from our own relative plenitude, and thus capable of agape at the natural level. Indeed, insofar as we are endowed with reason, we are able to decenter from ourselves and act gratuitously for the sake of another. We are capable of benevolence, often to the point of sacrifice. In human love, eros and agape do not exist entirely apart from one another. While eros always entails passivity and desire, it also entails a moment of relative self-transcendence, of self-abandonment. In that moment, it gestures to agape, even if its own movement ultimately returns to the self. Agape, in turn, presents itself as active self-giving, but insofar as no gift can succeed in absence of another who receives it, human agape, too, has an intimate need for the other's receptivity. This is, by the way, the reason why we tend to think that unrequited love contains an element of tragedy. Love calls for a response, but said response cannot be coerced. It must be free. When Christians profess their faith in the one triune God, a God that consists of reciprocal relations between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they are pointing in this direction. In more mundane human terms, we recognize this kind of free, reciprocal benevolence in friendship, inasmuch as friends return love for love, and both desire to do good things for one another. This is not to say that being friends with others can be simply equated with agapao, any more than it can be equated with eramai or estergo. As Florensky notes, the difference between agapao in the pre-Christian sense and phileo lies in the former's reliance on judgment, in contrast with the latter's origin in a particular inclination. Likewise, the difference between eramai and phileo lies in that the former focuses on the affective and sensual element, whereas the latter focuses on the mutual immanence of friends, their intimate closeness. Finally, stergo and phileo differ because the latter refers to generic qualities such as sympathy, affability, or tenderness that are not necessarily linked to a specific person, as in friendship, but to human beings in general. Accordingly, friendship is marked by the immediacy and the spontaneity of its origin, always in light of personal contact and not merely of organic bonds, as in estergo. Friendship refers to the whole person and not just a rational appreciation of their qualities, as in agapao, to the warm quality of the sentiment it engenders, without it being passionate or impulsive, and to the closeness and personal intimacy that it encourages. There is no love without a loving subject, and an object of love that is regarded as good or appropriate, towards which we develop an affective unity. Love resides more in the lover than in the object of love, even if love reaches its plenitude in symmetric reciprocity. Ideally, the basic structural distinction between the subject and object of love points at a real distinction. One person loves another. Yet we also speak of self-love, which contains no real distinction between the subject and the object of love. While in this case, the affective unity of love follows from substantial unity with oneself, in the other cases, love follows from some likeness with oneself. At times, this connection has been criticized on the grounds that it brings back love of others to love of self. Thus, some hold that the common description of friends as other selves, the so-called mirror approach to friendship, could be regarded as a subtle form of self-love, which does not sufficiently account for the other's alterity. Yet this can be interpreted differently insofar as we take a deeper approach to self-love. To begin with, we should note that unlike substantial unity, affective unity consists in a certain connaturalness or complacency of the subject with the object, perceived as fitting, as adequate to the subject, for a variety of reasons that represent the various reasons for love. Such complacency, in turn, eventually constitutes the principle of a movement towards real union with that object. From this perspective, love demands some apprehension of the good that is love. Asserting the priority of knowledge, however, does not mean that perfect love requires perfect knowledge. For while the perfection of knowledge requires that man should know distinctly all that it is in a thing, such as its parts, powers, and properties, the perfection of love only requires that a thing be loved according as it is known in itself, it is, in its alterity. For this reason, a thing can be loved perfectly even without being perfectly known. This might explain Harry Frankfurt's point concerning why love itself, rather than an apprehended good, can often be taken as a proper source of value. Just as we speak of a sensitive love that follows sensible apprehension, we can also speak of our intellectual or rational love that follows what reason presents us as good. Interestingly, though, the ancients did not restrict the term love to sentient and rational beings alone. Insofar as they spoke of a natural appetite, they also spoke of natural love, meaning the love that every natural being has for whatever is convenient to it, whatever contributes to its flourishing and perfection. In this way, for instance, we say that plants love water. While self-love, love for one's consistency, is obviously part of natural love, I want to stress that natural love already brings its subjects beyond themselves, simply because as finite creatures, they are dependent on God. They are, metaphysically speaking, relational beings. Hence, Aquinas could say that in the state of perfect nature, there is a mistake here, human beings love God more than themselves. This provides an ultimate reason for what Harry Frankfurt notes about self-love, namely that it is necessarily derivative from or constructed out of the love that people have for things that are not identical with themselves. A person cannot love himself except insofar as he loves other things. Stressing this idea is important in order to leave behind the modern controversy about amour pur, which, starting with Bossuet and Fenelon, so heavily impacted on both theological and philosophical thought, making that self-love and altruism were considered to be systematically at odds. The truth is that human love cannot just skip over the natural conditions of human beings, which inserts us in a regime of need and desire. Yet, as Joseph de Finance once noted, insofar as we are creatures who have their being from God, there is a fundamental affinity between us and God, antecedent to every desire. Love thus appears as a principle of unity at different levels, even though in the human case, the realization of such unity in practice goes hand in hand with deliberation and choice. Early sociologists, such as Comte and later on Pietirin Sorokin, were not wrong when concerned with the erosion of social bonds. They assigned love a prominent place in their social theories. Certainly, speaking of natural love does not solve our practical problems, I know. For this, we need to consider that in shaping our natural inclinations and responses, reason opens for us a regime of freedom that accounts for a particular form of self-transcendence. Therein, the other appears in a new light, not just as the object of my love and desire, but also as a proper subject of love and desires. It's only at this point that we can begin to speak of love in relational terms and appreciate its ecstatic character. It is the fact that love brings one outside of oneself. Crucially, by introducing distance from our own inclinations, reason makes it possible for human beings to recognize one another as different persons, as authentically other selves, and to love one another accordingly. Rational self-love makes room for genuine love for the other. At this level, the natural complacency of the lover in the beloved becomes a celebration of the other's existence, which echoes God's original bestowal of being. As an act that expresses natural affinity or complacency with an object, love can be regarded as the fundamental act of a living being. As such, it is a fundamental act of our will. The practical relevance of love is one of the ideas that marks Harry Frankfurt's work. For him, human beings' natural love can be declined according to different, more particular reasons. While some of these reasons can be originally provided by the passions, in order to move us effectively, they have to be sanctioned by deliberate reason and choice. Now, in light of this new rational horizon, a new meaning of love can emerge whereby one wills the good for another. Aquinas calls it dilectio. Kant calls it practical love. And explicitly distinguishing it from love as a feeling, he regards it as a moral duty. According to Aquinas, dilectio differs from passion in that it does not seek its object with eagerness, but it is also more than benevolence or goodwill. For dilectio involves union of affections between the lover and the beloved, inasmuch as the lover deems the beloved as somewhat united to him or belonging to him, and so tends toward him. Jacques Maritain emphasized dilectio as the most properly human form of love. Importantly, it has its principle in the choice a subject makes, which can eventually be devoid of passion, but can also consist in introducing order into what passion itself presented as valuable in the first place. In this latter sense, human love is marked by involuntary attraction and deliberate choice that actually seeks the good of the other. Kantian practical love also differs from merely sensitive or pathological love in that it does not have its origin in the inferior faculty of desire. It is also more than benevolence, not so much because it introduces order in pre-existing affections, but rather because it is practically oriented towards beneficence, which is how Kant understands the duty to love one's neighbor as oneself. The universal scope of the maxim of benevolence, which is required for practical love, is also present in the attitude of the philanthropist, who is a friend of humanity in general. Yet, as Kant notes, the rather generic interest the philanthropist takes in others, just because they are human beings, represents the slightest degree of benevolence. This is why, unlike mere goodwill, practical benevolence or beneficence, as implicit in the command to love one's neighbor as oneself, is measured against the love we have for ourselves. For it is clear that in practice I take more interest in my own ends than in those of others. I love myself more than others. Accordingly, practical love consists in making the well-being and happiness of others my end. In considering the spatial and temporal circumstances of human agency, beneficence brings the universality of benevolence down to earth. Dilectio and practical love place us on the soil of freedom and thus on a moral soil. When Frankfurt asserts that loving someone of something essentially means or consists in taking its interests as reasons for acting to serve those interests, he places himself directly in this terrain. Loving someone, he writes, has less to do with what a person believes or with how he feels than with a configuration of the will that consists in practical concern for the beloved. This volitional configuration shapes the dispositions and conduct of the lover with respect to what he loves, by guiding him in the design and ordering of his relevant purposes and priorities. It is important to avoid confusing love with infatuation, lust, obsession, possessiveness, and dependency in their various forms. In warning us about the latter confusions, Frankfurt implicitly points at the classic distinction between amor concupiscentiae and amor amicitiae. Interestingly, Aquinas' approach to this distinction is not primarily a moral one. For him, amor concupiscentiae represents a particular kind of love, namely the love that we feel for something that we want for ourselves. By contrast, amor amicitiae represents the love that we feel for someone for whom we want something. Thus, when I want a bottle of wine, I actually love two things. I love the wine with amor concupiscentiae, and I love myself with amor amicitiae. Of course, if I want the bottle of wine for you, then it is you that I love with amor amicitiae. While both forms of love are rooted in natural inclination and are thus marked by sentiment and affection, the quality of that sentiment is different. It follows from a different apprehension of the kind of union in which that bond of affection consists. And yes, I know, unlike amor concupiscentiae, amor amicitiae is based on reciprocal communication. As Aquinas puts it, when we love a thing by desiring it, we apprehend it as belonging to our well-being. In like manner, when a man loves another with the love of friendship, he wills good to him just as he wills good to himself. The important thing here is that the lover stands, in friendship, the lover stands to the object of his love as to himself, and in concupiscence as to something belonging to himself. So friendship is a kind of personal love, whilst concupiscence is not of the personal kind. The love of friendship responds better to the ecstatic nature of love than the love of concupiscence because of the former focuses on the good of the other. Well, taking these distinctions into account explains the way in which love can or cannot be object of education and command. This is the important thing. And just a few words to summarize the rest of the paper. If we understand the structure of friendship, we can also understand what it means to raise a child so that he can develop this form of love. Unless he finds this of love within the family, it's very difficult that he can develop this kind of love outside the family. And finally, if we understand the dynamism of friendship, we also understand the dynamism of charity. It's interesting that Aquinas puts both, traces this analogy. Ultimately, the dynamism of charity assumes the dynamism of friendship, but charity also introduces an additional reason for overcoming natural differences among human beings and even for developing a psychology of friendship with everyone. This is very important. What's the additional force of charity? That it redeems the other forms of love and it allows to develop a psychology of friendship with everyone, even with those with whom you don't have a particular, towards whom you don't have a particular inclination. I end just with a quote by Saint John Henry Newman. By trying to love our relations and friends, by submitting to their wishes, so contrary to our own, by bearing with their infirmities, by overcoming their occasional waywardness with kindness, by dwelling on their excellences and trying to copy them, thus it is that we form in our hearts that root of charity, which, though small at first, may, like the mustard seed, at last even overshadow the earth. Thank you.